In the spring of 1874, the Mill River in western Massachusetts broke its dam. The wall went at 7:20 in the morning, and within minutes, a wave of water 20 feet high was moving south through the valley at the speed of a galloping horse. It tore through Williamsburg first, then Haydenville, then Leeds and Florence. It killed 139 people in under an hour and destroyed nearly 1,000 buildings before it spent itself in the floodplain near Northampton. Every newspaper in New England covered it. Congress sent investigators. Engineers argued about dam design for the next decade. But nobody wrote about what the water uncovered when it receded. Because what the Mill River left behind, carved into the exposed riverbank below the Williamsburg Township line, was a burial field unlike anything anyone in the Connecticut River Valley had ever documented. Bones, dozens of sets of bones, laid out in deliberate rows in the sediment, exposed by the force of the water stripping away 10 feet of accumulated earth in a matter of minutes. And they were large. Not unusually large in the way that regional variation or individual height might produce. Large in a way that stopped the men who found them from continuing their work and sent one of them riding back toward town without a word of explanation to the others. Within 3 days, the site had been visited by officials from the county, representatives of the State Geological Survey, and at least 2 men whose institutional affiliation was never publicly established. Within 2 weeks, the exposed bank had been covered over, the bones removed, and the site designated a debris field in the official flood damage report. The Mill River flood of 1874 is one of the most documented industrial disasters in 19th century American history. The burial field it exposed has no official record. Let's go back further. Because the Mill River Valley didn't become significant in 1874, it had been significant for a very long time before that. The Connecticut River Valley, of which the Mill River system is a tributary network, sits in the middle of one of the most archaeologically dense corridors in northeastern North America. Indigenous habitation in this valley stretches back at least 12,000 years, possibly longer. The Pocumtuck people, who were the primary inhabitants of this region before European contact, maintained oral traditions describing their own ancestors as relative newcomers to a valley that had been occupied by a previous people of considerably greater physical stature. That detail is not marginal to Pocumtuck tradition, it is central to it. The previous inhabitants were not described vaguely. They were described specifically as a people who shaped the land, who moved stone, redirected water, and constructed things that the Pocumtuck found still standing when they arrived and could not account for in their own history. Mainstream archaeology files this under mythology. It has been doing that for 150 years. But the physical record in the Connecticut River Valley is harder to file away. Survey work conducted in the 1840s and 1850s, before the valley's development accelerated, documented over 40 earthwork sites of deliberate construction between Springfield and Northampton alone. Not burial mounds in the familiar Hopewell or Adena tradition. Something else. Low, wide platforms with geometric regularity. Drainage channels cut into bedrock at intervals too consistent to be natural. Stone arrangements along the river's eastern bank that several early surveyors independently noted bore more resemblance to infrastructure than to ceremonial markers. Most of those sites are now under roads, farm fields, or the foundations of buildings constructed between 1850 and 1900. The ones that weren't built over were excavated, and the excavation records from this period follow a pattern that researchers who've spent time in the Massachusetts State Archives will recognize immediately. Initial documentation. Anomalous finds noted. Report file. Second visit by different officials. Report revised. Original documentation reclassified. The same sequence. Every time. Now here's what makes 1874 specifically important and where the flood becomes more than a natural disaster. The Williamsburg Dam that failed in May of that year had been constructed in 1865. When they poured the foundation and cut into the eastern bank to anchor the structure, the construction crew reported finding work stone at a depth that predated any known settlement in the area by a significant margin. The site supervisor's notes, which survive in partial form in the Hampshire County Registry of Deeds, misfiled under a property dispute from 1871. Describe the stone as cut and fitted in a manner consistent with deliberate construction and inconsistent with any natural process. The notes end abruptly. The next page in the original binding is missing. 9 years later, the dam failed, and the water that poured through the breach stripped the valley floor down to that same pre-settlement stratum. And what was in it had been waiting there, undisturbed, since before anyone thought to write things down. Here's what the record does show, even in its suppressed and partial state. A letter survives. It was written on May 20th, 1874, 4 days after the flood, by a man named Asa Rennie, who was a foreman with one of the road-clearing crews working the valley south of Williamsburg. The letter is addressed to his wife in Northampton. It is currently held in a private family collection whose owners allowed a researcher to transcribe it in 1962. The transcription exists in a file at the Forbes Library in Northampton that has been miscatalogued for decades as agricultural correspondence. Rennie wrote that his crew had found, in the exposed bank below the Williamsburg line, bones of unusual size, arranged in what he called clear order, as if placed by intention and not by any accident of nature. He described the skulls as twice the circumference of a normal man's head. He described the arm bones as longer than most men are tall from hip to foot. He described his crew foreman, a man named Graves, dropping to his knees in the mud and refusing to stand up for the better part of an hour. And then he described the arrival, on the following morning, of 2 men in good clothes who arrived in a surveyor's wagon, spoke to the county supervisor privately, and had the site roped off before noon. Rennie never mentioned the bones again in any surviving correspondence. Whatever he was told or whatever he understood it completely. The institutional response to this kind of discovery in the 1870s followed a well-established logic. The Smithsonian Institution, which had been systematically collecting and then systematically losing anomalous skeletal remains since the 1840s, had by 1874 developed an informal but consistent protocol for exactly this type of situation. Sites that produced remains inconsistent with established models of American prehistory were documented internally, acquired rapidly, and removed from public access. Not because of malice, necessarily. The 19th century scientific establishment operated from a model of American prehistory that had been constructed to support specific conclusions about the continent's past and the people it had contained. A burial field of individuals 8, 9, 10 feet tall, arranged in deliberate rows in the New England River Valley, did not support those conclusions. It demolished them. And so the protocol existed, and the protocol worked. What it couldn't do was reach every private letter, every informal account, every piece of knowledge that moved through communities the way knowledge moved before institutions learned to intercept it at scale. Rennie's letter survived because it was misfiled, because someone organized a library wrong, because the systems of official suppression are comprehensive but never perfect. There are 3 other accounts from the 1874 flood zone that describe the same site in the same week. A diary entry from a woman named Clara Bigelow in Florence, a brief notation in the records of the First Congregational Church of Williamsburg, added to a damage inventory in a different handwriting than the rest, and a single paragraph in a letter from a state geological survey assistant named Whitfield to a colleague in Boston, in which he describes being ordered off a site before he could complete his measurements. By authority, he did not question because he recognized the institutional affiliation of the man doing the ordering. Whitfield's letter is in the Massachusetts State Archives. It has been there since 1874. Nobody has pulled it for this purpose before because nobody knew to look for it in a box labeled Internal Correspondence, Geological Survey, 1874, in a drawer that has not been fully indexed. The knowledge was never destroyed. It was only ever filed. The Mill River Valley today looks like any other piece of recovered New England landscape. The flood damage is invisible. The sites that were exposed and then covered are invisible. The bones that were removed and then lost inside an institution large enough to lose things on purpose are invisible. But the river still runs over the same ground it stripped bare in 1874, and the stratum it exposed is still down there. Every spring the water rises.